March 2nd, 1945. A coded cable arrived at the supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force. This was the Hotel Trianon Palace in Versailles, Paris. It was a place of polished floors and maps. It was miles away from the freezing mud of the Siegfried Line. The paper was intended for General Dwight D. Eisenhower. The sender was General George S. Patton, commander of the Third Army. Military communications are typically sterile. They list tonnage of fuel. They count the dead. They provide precise map coordinates for artillery strikes. This message followed none of those rules. It was brief. It was blunt. It carried a level of sarcasm that stunned the signal corps. The text contained only 9 words. "Have taken Trier with 2 divisions. Do you want me to give it back?" The staff officers in Paris froze. The clicking of typewriters stopped. Some men looked away in silence. Others let out a sharp, nervous laugh. They understood the situation. Only hours before, Eisenhower's staff had issued a direct command to the Third Army. The order was explicit. Patton was to bypass the city of Trier. Intelligence reports claimed the city was a fortress. The High Command believed it was too reinforced for a quick assault. They calculated that a minimum of 4 divisions was necessary to breach the perimeter. Eisenhower ordered Patton to wait. The order arrived too late. By the time the ink dried in Paris, Patton's tanks were already in the city center. He had captured the oldest city in Germany ahead of schedule. He ignored the tactical manual and moved faster than the bureaucracy. Now, he was openly mocking his superior. The telegram was a trophy. It was a signal to the High Command that their calculations were wrong. Patton had the city. He had no intention of letting it go. The war continued. This is the history of a single telegram. More importantly, it is the account of the impossible battle that forced its delivery. George S. Patton did not just advance, he shattered the Siegfried Line, forced a crossing over a river under constant fire, and demonstrated a core truth of the war. Other generals relied on maps and slow logistics. Patton relied on raw instinct. To understand why the capture of Trier was considered impossible, the context of February 1945 is vital. The Third Army stood before the West Wall. The Allies knew it as the Siegfried Line. It remained the most sophisticated defensive network in human history. Adolf Hitler ordered its construction for one purpose: the absolute protection of the German fatherland. The line was not a simple trench. It was a kill zone. The defenses ran miles deep into the forest. The landscape was littered with reinforced concrete bunkers and camouflaged artillery batteries. Thousands of mines lay beneath the soil. Rows of concrete pyramids, known as dragon's teeth, emerged from the earth. Their only function was to high-center a tank and stop an armored division dead in its tracks. The environment offered no relief. The weather was freezing. Constant rain turned the terrain into a thick soup of mud. The footage shows heavy tanks sinking up to their axles in the sludge. Supply trucks stalled in the mire. Thousands of soldiers suffered from trench foot in the damp foxholes. Most Allied commanders looked at the Siegfried Line and hesitated. They chose to wait. They demanded clear skies for air support. They requested stockpiles of millions of shells. February 22, 1945. General George S. Patton picked up the phone. On the other end was General Walton Walker, the commander of the 20th Corps. Walker was short, stout, and constantly angry. He possessed a relentless aggression that Patton admired. Patton called him his bulldog. Patton pointed at the operational map. His finger landed on the triangle of land wedged between the Saar and Moselle rivers. At the very tip of this triangle sat the city of Trier. It was not just another objective. Trier was a prize. The Romans founded it 2,000 years ago, making it the oldest city in Germany. Beyond the history, it was a vital logistics hub. Every major road junction for German supply lines heading to the Rhine passed through its center. Patton issued the order. He told Walker to punch a hole through the defensive line and take Trier. Walker studied the map. The terrain was a tactical nightmare. He saw steep hills, dense forests, and concrete pillboxes covering every approach. Walker did not hesitate or question the difficulty. He simply asked when the attack should begin. To break the Siegfried Line, Patton deployed his elite force. He committed the 10th Armored Division. They were known as the Tiger Division. On February 19th, the assault began. This was not a subtle maneuver or a flanking operation. It was a sledgehammer strike. The footage would show rows of American tanks roaring forward. They slammed into the Dragon's teeth, the jagged concrete blocks designed to stop armor. Combat engineers didn't wait. They ran into the open under heavy machine gun fire. They planted explosives and blew gaps in the concrete. The sound of constant explosions filled the air. Progress was slow and bloody. German artillery fire rained down from the surrounding heights. The 94th Infantry Division moved alongside the tanks. They cleared the pillboxes one by one. The soldiers crawled toward the concrete bunkers. They threw grenades into narrow firing slits. They used flamethrowers to burn the defenders out of the reinforced structures. The smell of burning fuel and cordite hung over the battlefield. For 3 days, the advance stalled. It looked like a stalemate. The tanks churned the earth into a deep, thick sludge. If the mud had been solid, the tanks might have moved. Instead, they struggled in the cold rain. But the pressure did not stop. February 1945. The weather was winning. American tanks were sliding off the frozen roads and into the ditches. At Supreme Headquarters in Paris, the mood was anxious. Eisenhower's staff watched the map updates every hour. They saw the Third Army moving inches at a time through the slush. Eisenhower worried that Patton was getting bogged down in the mud. He worried about the mounting casualty lists. Staff officers began to draft plans to halt the entire operation. They wanted to shift resources to Montgomery in the north. Montgomery was preparing for his own massive crossing of the Rhine. As always, he demanded every gallon of fuel and every shell. If Patton stalled, Eisenhower would take his supplies and give them to the British. Patton knew the stakes. He felt the clock ticking against him. He wasn't just fighting the German Wehrmacht, he was fighting the politics of the Allied High Command. He drove directly to the front lines. The footage would show his boots covered in thick gray mud. He stood in the rain, screaming at his tank commanders. He told them to keep moving. He told them that if they stopped, they died. The line finally cracked. On February 24th, the 10th Armored Division broke through the main belt of the Siegfried Line. Concrete bunkers were bypassed. Suddenly, the Americans were in the open country. The German rear guard collapsed into a state of panic. The heavy Tiger tanks began to retreat. They raced east toward the Saar River and the city of Trier. By late February, Patton's forces were closing in on the outskirts. But the Germans were not giving up the city easily. Trier was a natural fortress. It was surrounded by steep hills and protected by the deep waters of the Moselle River. The German High Command issued a direct order. Trier must be held to the last man. No retreat was permitted. Soldiers flooded the approaches to the city to create artificial swamps. They rigged every bridge with heavy explosives. At first glance, the city was a trap. But in reality, it was a race. The sound of artillery grew louder. The Americans reached the riverbanks. They saw the wires leading to the demolition charges on the bridges. There was no turning back now. Patton pushed his men forward. The final assault began under a gray sky. The city waited. "4,000 German soldiers. This was the estimate hitting the desks at Allied headquarters. The reports were specific. Intelligence officers identified anti-tank batteries hidden inside the ancient Roman ruins. The planners at SHAF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, ran the numbers. Military doctrine was clear. To take a fortified city through house-to-house urban combat, an attacker needs a 3-to-1 advantage. 4-to-1 is better. Patton did not have those numbers. He had only 2 units in the sector, the 10th Armored and the 94th Infantry. On paper, he was evenly matched against a dug-in enemy. In reality, he was outnumbered. Eisenhower's operations officer saw the danger. He believed Patton was walking into a trap. The staff warned of a meat grinder. They predicted thousands of casualties in the narrow city streets. The advice was simple: bypass Trier. Move around the city and let the following units handle the siege later. It was a logical decision. It was a safe decision. Eisenhower signed off on the order. A message was drafted. The paper moved through the chain of command. The instructions were absolute: bypass Trier, do not engage, and wait for reinforcements. But communication in March 1945 was slow. The orders had to be encrypted. They had to be typed by clerks. They had to be handed to motorcycle couriers who navigated mud and ruins to reach the front. Events moved faster than the ink. While the couriers were still kickstarting their engines, the sound of tank engines filled the air near the city limits. The message was moving at 30 miles per hour on a motorcycle. Patton's lead elements were already moving at full speed toward the German lines. At first glance, a strategic pause, but in reality, a race against the mail. The footage from the era shows the scale: columns of Sherman tanks stretching back for miles, clouds of dust rising from the frozen roads, artillery shells stacked high in the mud. There was no turning back. By the time the courier reached the command post, the situation had changed. March 1st, 1945. The order to halt was making its slow journey from Paris to the front lines. General George S. Patton did not wait for the paperwork. He sensed hesitation from the high command. He knew Eisenhower would likely command a full stop. Patton decided to create a fait accompli. He chose to give his superiors a finished result instead of a request. He called General Walker. His instructions were direct: take Trier. Do it tonight. The 10th Armored Division waited on the hills overlooking the city. Below them, Trier lay in total darkness. The ancient streets were silent. The commander of the assault force faced a tactical crisis. Only one path existed for his heavy armor: the bridges. The Moselle River acted as a natural barrier, cutting the city off from the advancing Americans. At first glance, a simple river crossing, but in reality, a potential massacre. If the German defenders blew the bridges, the tanks would be stranded on the riverbank. The infantry would have to cross in rubber boats under heavy fire. They would be slaughtered in the water. Two main structures spanned the river: the Kaiserbrücke and the Römerbrücke. The Römerbrücke was the Roman bridge. It was a massive feat of engineering. The bridge had stood for nearly 2,000 years. It was built in 16 BC. Roman legions had marched over these stones. Medieval knights had crossed them. Napoleon had moved his grand army across this same span. Now, American Sherman tanks were approaching. Events accelerated. The Germans one single detonator. That was the only thing standing between the Americans and a total stalemate. The plan was simple and extremely high risk. Units had to rush the city under the cover of darkness. They needed speed to shock the defenders. They had to capture the bridge before any German soldier could push the plunger. Lieutenant Colonel Jack Richardson took the lead. 2 in the morning. At that moment, the American tank engines roared to life. They skipped the traditional artillery preparation. A barrage would have warned the German garrison. Instead, they relied on pure momentum. Why did they choose such a gamble? It seemed like suicide, but speed was their only weapon. The tanks smashed through the roadblocks on the outskirts of the city. Metal twisted, timber shattered. The column raced down the winding roads leading into the valley. German sentries heard the steel tracks and fired flares. Suddenly, the night turned bright white. Machine gun fire erupted from the windows of the residential houses. Panzerfaust rockets streaked through the air. The lead American tank took a direct hit. It burst into flames. Black smoke filled the street, but the column did not stop. Soldiers pushed the burning wreck off the road and kept moving. At first glance, a successful breakthrough, but in reality, a race against a fuse. The unit reached the first objective, the Kaiserbrücke Bridge. The lead tank was only yards away from the stone entrance. A massive explosion ripped through the air. The sound was deafening. The bridge collapsed into the river in a cloud of dust and debris. The Germans had successfully blown the charges. This left only one option: the Roman bridge. Richardson ordered his men to drive at maximum speed. They had to reach the last crossing immediately. The tanks navigated the narrow medieval streets of the old town. Stone walls scraped against armor. Maps were useless in the dark. The crews followed the flow of the river. The footage would have shown a chaotic maze of shadows and fire. The sound of clanking metal echoed off the buildings. They turned a sharp corner. There it was. The Roman bridge was still standing. Events accelerated. There was no turning back. March 2nd, 1945. The bridge at Trier remained standing, but the approach was a kill zone covered by German machine gun nests. Engineers had already primed the explosives. This was the moment of decision. If the structure collapsed, Patton's gamble ended there. 2 divisions would be trapped on the wrong side of the river. General Eisenhower's warnings would become a reality. A platoon of infantry led by a young lieutenant jumped from the backs of the Shermans. They hit the pavement and sprinted toward the stone arches. The footage would show tracers everywhere. Bullets sparked off the ancient masonry. Men fell into the roadway, but the line kept moving. They reached the center of the span. The air was heavy with the smell of wet stone and gunpowder. Every soldier expected the ground to vanish. They waited to be vaporized in a wall of fire, but the explosion never came. Why did the bridge hold? At first glance, it was a miracle, but in reality, it was a failure of German nerves. Maybe the commander hesitated to pull the switch. Maybe a stray round severed the wire. Maybe the detonator simply failed. Or perhaps the sheer speed of the American assault broke their focus. The Germans saw enemy bayonets on the bridge and panicked. Events accelerated. The Americans reached the far side and located the demolition wires. They cut the cables with combat knives. They stormed the bridge house and neutralized the defenders. A green flare hissed into the sky. The signal was clear. The bridge was secure. Within minutes, 30-ton Sherman tanks of the 10th Armored Division surged forward. The sound of metal tracks grinding against Roman stone echoed through the valley. It was a mechanical roar that signaled the end. Once the armor entered the city streets, the German defense evaporated. Soldiers dropped their weapons and raised their hands. The Germans surrendered in blocks. By dawn, the firing stopped. Trier was under American control. The stars and stripes rose over the Porta Nigra. The ancient Roman gate watched as the Third Army marched through. The gamble had paid off. March 2nd, 1945. George Patton captured a fortress city. He secured a crossing over the Moselle River. He accomplished this with minimal casualties. It was a tactical masterstroke. Headquarters believed the mission required 4 divisions. Patton did it with 2. Later that morning, Patton stood in his headquarters. He held a lit cigar. He listened to the reports streaming in from the front lines in Trier. The reports were good. The city was under American control. Then an aide entered the room. The officer looked nervous. He carried a single sheet of paper. It was a message from Supreme Headquarters. It was signed by General Eisenhower. Patton took the paper. He read the text. It was the formal order drafted the previous day. The command was clear: bypass Trier. The report stated it would take 4 divisions to capture the stronghold. Patton read the words a second time. He began to chuckle. The chuckle turned into a loud, booming laugh. The irony was complete. The military bureaucracy moved too slowly. His Third Army moved too fast. The orders were obsolete before the ink was dry. Patton looked at his staff officers. He told them that the planners believed the mission was impossible. He noted their demand for 4 divisions. He sat at his desk and grabbed a pencil. He had a choice. A standard reply was possible. He could have written, "Mission accomplished, Trier secured." That was the professional response. But Patton was still angry. He felt the sting of a lack of trust. He was tired of Eisenhower prioritizing the British General Montgomery. He wanted to highlight their error. He wrote a short message. It contained the famous words, "Have taken Trier with 2 divisions." Then he added the punchline. "Do you want me to give it back?" He handed the paper to the radio operator. He ordered the man to send it directly to Eisenhower. The message arrived at Versailles. It caused an immediate stir among the high command. Eisenhower was a serious man carrying the weight of the global conflict. He read the telegram. He couldn't help but smile. It was classic Patton. It was arrogant and insubordinate. It was also undeniably brilliant. Eisenhower knew a reprimand was impossible. A general is not punished for winning a major victory ahead of schedule. The capture of Trier changed the map. It opened the gateway to the Rhine River. Experts believe it accelerated the end of the war by several weeks. Eisenhower folded the telegram and put it in his pocket. He did not answer the sarcastic question. He issued a new order. "Congratulations. Keep moving." The message sent a shockwave through the Allied command. It silenced the critics. It proved a point. The Patton method worked. It relied on speed, violence, and ignoring the rulebook. It outperformed the cautious approach favored by the British. For the soldiers of the Third Army, the telegram became a legend. Men whispered the story in mess halls. They shared the details in frozen foxholes. The troops felt a new sense of pride. They felt like an outlaw army. They believed they could achieve the impossible. The capture of Trier is often overshadowed by the Battle of the Bulge, but it remains the perfect example of Patton's genius. He understood a simple fact. In war, time is the only currency that matters. Waiting for reinforcements would have given the Germans time to dig in. It would have turned Trier into a bloodbath like Stalingrad. By attacking immediately with less, he achieved more. That telegram remains one of the sharpest lines in military history. It served as a reminder to the planners and politicians. While they debated what was possible, the warriors had already finished the job. Thus ended the battle for Trier.